Well, we're here for another lecture. This is basically going to be part two of the airway management guidelines. As always, this is me, Felipe Urdaneta, coming to you in an asynchronous method here for communication with you. So, I think the bottom line is I hope that you guys have had a chance to read over the material that I suggested, the reading material that I suggested in the first lecture. Maybe perhaps you've also had a chance to experience this in the operating room or perhaps in an ICU, wherever is it that you experience airway management. And today what we're going to do is kind of do part two, which is a critical analysis of the airway management guidelines. Now, I must say here, first of all, I'm a big fan of the guidelines themselves. Even though I'm going to be providing a critical analysis and I'm going to be critical on them, it doesn't mean I do not follow them or do not recommend them or anything like that. Not at all. I just think that I would like to see in the next 10 years, perhaps the next version, of some changes that make it a little bit more modern. Because unfortunately, in my opinion, the first thing that I would like to say, philosophical kind of conclusion, is the fact that the guidelines are starting to show a little bit of their age, in my opinion. You can remember, you can also download more stuff here in this barcode. Just basically open up your PDF and download the articles that you think are needed. This is all related, of course, to airway management guidelines. So the issue is, one of the things is that we perhaps have seen or that you have experienced, hopefully, is the fact that a difficult intubation exposes several periods of vulnerabilities. And they can be at the personal level, in other words, individual level, in terms of vulnerabilities in groups and teams, and of course in institutions and organizations. It basically shows us that there are things that we could be doing better. Now, one of the most important advances in airway management in the past 40 years happens to be the guidelines themselves. In fact, if you look at the literature, and you can see that despite the fact that our population is getting more challenging, more obese, etc., there's a decrease, a dramatic decrease in the incidence of failure and difficult airway management. A lot of people attribute this to instruments or perhaps a particular tool or another. I don't. I think the most important advancement in airway management happens to be when the team or the person taking care of the airway has a strategic plan and follows it, and of course is complemented with proper tools and instruments. But without strategy, it will be like, imagine at this point us not having our global positioning system, the way we has revolutionized the way we fly, the way we actually navigate, etc., etc. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that current guidelines qualify as a satellite with precision of mathematical precision. No, they're more a little bit like a lighthouse. But nonetheless, that lighthouse is crucial when you're having difficult negotiating an airway. Now, how did they come about? Well, basically, perhaps the best definition is they looked at reverse engineering of airway management. They looked at procedures, at basically basic and advanced procedures, and they looked at rescue and crisis management. And they were able to basically, and this is a big nutshell here, 30,000 feet above sea level, and is the fact that they were looking at potential pitfalls in our Achilles heel, which is basically obviously technical difficulties when handling the airway or inadequacies in oxygenation. One particular problem that we have been facing throughout the history of airway management, which happens to be repeated intubation attempts. Number three, failure to prepare to perform or prepare for frontal neck access, and number four, non-technical aspects with airway management. So when they were looking at this, they were looking at all the factors that could contribute negatively to the management of the airway. Now, in order to do a critical analysis, we're going to what's called a SWOT. We're going to do a SWOT analysis. We're going to look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of current management guidelines. And of course, we're going to start with strengths. And none, obviously, like I said, I'm a big fan of the fact that we have guidelines. I'm thankful for them. I think they constitute the best practice and basically are based on best practices of the current methods that we have with airway management. And particularly the ASA algorithm is notorious because it led the framework for kind of the airway management plan, from evaluation to awake intubation to perhaps finding yourself in the non-urgent or in the urgent pathway, depending on, of course, whether you could actually ventilate the patient or not. This framework is the one is basically the same kind of skeleton or vertebral column of all airway guidelines around the world. It's actually, they're very similar, or they try to copy that. Having said that, are there weaknesses? And there are. And the number one thing is that you can imagine that having guidelines that serve all particular patients, populations, demographics, etc., is very difficult. There cannot be just one guideline that serves everybody, because airway is practiced in a wide spectrum of patients. The other thing is, I think it's a mistake to think about intubation as being the end point. It's rather the middle point. And we already have seen this diaphragm, or similar diaphragm before, that is basically, you have to consider the preparation, the personnel, the resources, the pharmacology, checking the tube position, checking ventilation, and monitoring the patients. Basically, it's a gamut of things that basically, once the tube goes in, it cannot mean that everything went well before, or that basically nothing is needed afterwards. And I think that's one of the major problems that we have, with weaknesses of airway management guidelines. Because if you think about it, and this is a fourth generation. Every 10 years it gets updated, and you can see there from the title that it basically keeps on talking of the difficult airway. But in terms of that, is we cannot really predict with adequate sensitivity when we're going to have difficult airway. So I think that one of the drawbacks is the fact that we need them to basically be more broad and be constituted in terms of normal management of the airway in order to prevent difficulty from happening. Now, if you're basically, or if the guidelines just want to focus on crisis management and difficulty, well, by all means, do it. But right now, the way it's engineered, if you think about a criticism, is that it's basically looking like this diaphragm on the right. It's information overload. It's too complicated, and it's meant specifically for experts, which basically means that when you're working on a team, or when you're nervous, it's going to be difficult to navigate because your senses are not completely there with you when you are nervous. The other thing that happens is, because you're working with people that perhaps are not expert, it's difficult to have a shared mental model because they don't know the guidelines the way you do. So it's actually difficult. Another potential problem, or actually not potential, I think it's a big problem, is in terms of equipment and ergonomics, the ASA has been too broad as to continue or talk about the different equipment that should be done for a particular task. I think the ASA should actually avoid this problem that we have, and the paradox of choice, and pick one or two devices for each particular task. Now, the reason why they have not done so is because sometimes we don't have sufficient or robust evidence that one or things work better than others. But then we actually then have to rely on experts to tell us which is perhaps the best device to use for a particular task. And I think that's one of the problems. And if you have been there, you've gotten lost, is because we have too many choices at each of the steps of the different steps of the algorithm. So that's a paradox. Another thing is already alluded to. I think it should be broader. It should just not be termed for the difficult airway, because one of the things that, believe it or not, the ASA has left out. Now, having been critical, I think there are opportunities. And I think in the next um, version, hopefully in the next 10 years, or maybe in the future versions, we will make him simpler. This is something that we would all like to see. Make him more simplified so that we can all follow. I think the number one thing is we have to look at each of the steps and think about how do we optimize what we have. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. Of course, if the patient is too difficult, there might not be nothing to optimize. But I think we always have to look at parameters and ideas that can help us actually manage better a particular situation. The same thing is we need to look for what's the best alternate strategy in case your plan A or plan B have failed. And I think that's something that I would like to see. The other thing, it's okay that when we say, I have failed, I need to do an alternative solution because my current solution is not working. I think other guidelines are better suited for that particular type of mentality and kind of framework. One thing I don't particularly like is if you look at it, is a kind of a still one page, or now there's in color, but it's one page and looking from above. But remember, we don't play sports from above. We play them at the playing field, and the same thing. It can be football for that matter. Yeah, sure, the X's and O's are important, but it's different when you're in the field. And that I think that the guidelines should be a little bit more streamlined, more three-dimensional, so to speak. I like to think about airway management as a pyramid type of thing. And you can see from pyramids that you have different levels. Most of us will get to level 1 or level 2, and if you can see about it, for example, my usual plan is the first attempt I might do laryngoscopy, and I might use video laryngoscopy, and I might use a regular geometry Mac blade. That's a plan. That's what I will do on most people. Now, if that fails, I go to the second stage, which is a little bit more advanced, and I might use the same thing, but a hyperangulated blade. If that fails, I'm going to rescue with a supraglottic device, and if that fails, I need to rescue with invasive option or frontal neck access. You can see that basically by frameworking it in kind of a three-dimensional pyramid, then you can actually have a better suited, and I can communicate that to the team working with me, and I can do it better. It's the same thing. It's just basically not shown in a page, single page, with expecting that stepwise linearity is going to follow, when we all know that stepwise linearity is no match for events that happen fast, like a difficult intubation or difficult airway, and that also behave in unpredictable fashion. So I don't think that an algorithm is actually adequate for that, not at least during the crisis management. That's just obviously my opinion. Same way that the Vortex have actually talked about different steps to optimize things. I think that's what the guidelines should actually tell us. What are the steps or the maneuvers that we ought to do to try to optimize management and try to get us to be successful? I think one major thing as well is that current guidelines omit pharmacology in the whole text. I mean, it's basically something that if you have a group, for example, of intensivists or emergency room physicians, if they read the ASA algorithm, they do not know what the best strategy is for pharmacological management of an airway. And I think that that's a mistake, and the ASA should actually clarify what their stance is in terms of muscle relaxants, in terms of which is the best option for intubation, et cetera, et cetera. I think omitting pharmacology is a mistake because pharmacology is an intrinsic aspect of our management of the airway. Now, last but not least, what are the threats if we don't do those things, if we don't modernize airway management guidelines? Well, I think I already told you that I think that one of the problems is we are now changing and making them too complicated and not streamlining them or modernizing them, is we're changing again to back to the era before the guidelines existed. And now we're thinking that a tool is going to get us out of trouble. As I always alluded to, when they call me, for example, the residents call me and say, what are you going to do for the airway? Well, I'm going to use device X or device Z or whatever that is. I say, remember, a tool is not a plan. A tool might be part of a plan, but it's not the plan per se. And what we're doing nowadays, going back to the era before the algorithm started, was the fact that we're thinking that a tool is going to get us out of the jam when that is not the way it should be. We should always consider the strategic approach to airway is perhaps one of the most important advances that we have learned, and that we need to continue doing that and never omit that part. I already alluded to that it started with reverse engineering of basic and advanced airway management and looking at crisis management as well. But I think we cannot just basically stick with that. I think we need to go and look at other things and look at other aspects of normal airway management, for example, personnel, for example, which tools or instruments we should be using. And those things are missing, and that includes also pharmacology, as I already alluded to. To give you an idea and to conclude here today, we basically are having in the rear view mirror COVID situation. Remember, COVID was terrible, and it was very difficult in terms of airway management because it was highly contagious condition that caused severe respiratory involvement and profound desaturation during airway management. So we made plans about it, and the plans were basically kind of the same way that I told you the pyramid. It was stepwise approach. So the first choice was always video laryngoscopy. That's most, if not all, airway management guidelines propose this, was the use of video laryngoscopy and the use of neuromuscular blockers, RSI, with limited number of personnel available that was wearing PPE. If that failed, then you escalated and you perhaps use a hyperangulated blade. If that fails, you went to supraglottic airway management. And if that fails, you basically went to frontal neck access. But that was the plan. Now, if you think about it, in those guidelines that we use for COVID, we learned that basically gave us kind of the framework of the things that we need to be doing. Who should be doing the airway, with what pharmacology we should be using, with what devices, and how to best rescue the patients in case we encounter difficulties. So we've done this before, and all we need to do is to basically copy that and do it again for all patients. So the same thing that we did on COVID patients, we can be using on non-COVID patients as well. And I think we have that, we've learned that. So I think in conclusion is, we have basically the framework. We know what the pitfalls are. We know where things can go wrong. We know what the kind of the playing field is. We know where things are. And all we need to do is to apply that knowledge, help us look at the guidelines as a method to basically negotiate difficulties and obstacles so we can actually find the best exit solution. So if we do that, and if we basically modernize them, bring them down a level in terms of complexity and look at them as more than just crisis management And more than just serving anesthesiologists, I think the guidelines will continue to be one of the most important advancements in airway management for the past 40 years. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Bye bye.